A very warm welcome to General Counselling, the podcast from Montresor Legal. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're new, which is quite possible as this is only our third episode, General Counselling is the legal podcast where we bring together leaders from private practice together with the cream of in-house to share their insights on the latest issues across the legal landscape with you, our valued network. Before we kick off this week's fantastic lawyers, a quick plug for what's coming up on General Counselling. We have some brilliant episodes in the pipe with guests including the European General Counsel of a major private equity firm, the chief executive of a major sports league, and partners from Magic Circle and top US firms sharing their views on their markets and how to develop your career in law. We'll be putting out a new episode bi-monthly, so follow us via the Montresor Legal LinkedIn page or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Maybe even leave us a review if you like what you hear. Today's episode, we're focusing in on alternative investments, known as hedge funds back in the day, but now encompassing a wide range of different asset classes and investor types. One of the jewels of London's financial services crown, the alternative sector plays a vital role in our success as a global financial centre, yet is one of the most misrepresented in certain sections of the media and public opinion. I'm joined by two lawyers, both giants of the alternative legal sector. From private practice, Akin Gump's Tim Pearce. Tim is one of those lawyers you absolutely don't need the legal directories to tell you is one of the top names in the field, although of course they do tell you that. Tim has built one of London's leading alternative investment practices at Akin and is widely considered one of the top advisors in this space. From in-house, we're lucky to be joined by Alex Mitchell. Alex has a career that almost any Magic Circle finance associate would love to imitate. He began his career at A&O in their derivatives practice, moving into the alternative sector with GSA before securing his first general counsel role with LMR, a multidisciplinary fund managing over $7 billion. Thank you, gents, for joining. It's a rainy Monday, so let's cheer everyone up and kick off with COVID. So, Tim, what do you see as the most significant impacts the pandemic has been having on the alternatives market?
Well, I suppose we're leaving aside the market itself, because I think we'll come on to that. I suppose I would talk about the two things that general counsels or senior in-house lawyers have been, I won't say moaning about, but that's raising concerns over. I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, really, asset raising is clearly very difficult, where the opportunity to interact personally and the opportunity for people to conduct in-person ODD it's making everything very challenging. And I think that what we saw post 08, and I think what we saw a little of this time around as well, was a flight to quality or perceived quality, let's say. And I think that's also been borne out when you look at the challenges that smaller managers have faced in relation to their asset raising activities. Because if you've got a big manager who has an ongoing relationship with Allborn and has been DD'd X number of times, it's clearly going to be an easier ask for them to get cash through the door from new investors. And that is a challenge that I don't have the answer to from my sort of perspective, but I think that's something that has been preoccupying managers, obviously all managers, but in particular the smaller managers and the startups. The other element is compliance, and the day-to-day compliance that goes on in a manager, where you have a compliance team or an individual, it might just be a GC, who is able to sit around the team, hear what's going on, and just keep an eye on things. And the FCA is focused on this as well, and asks firms what they're doing in this area. And I think that is again a big challenge and a big headache for managers. How do they deal with that? And how do you know that you have the right policies and procedures in place so you can stand essentially shoulder to shoulder with your peers? Because I think if something happens, clearly in every organisation something can happen with an individual or with a team that you don't foresee, or mistakes are made. But as long as you've got the policies and procedures in place as best you can to allow you to monitor those and try to head them off the path, I think that's really all you can do. So really, in that sense, I think it's understanding what your peers are doing and talking to your peers and your lawyers and your compliance consultants.
I think we've seen that certainly from the legal perspective, and especially if you're quite new to an institution. I think if you develop relationships with business people, whether you're a compliance or a legal advisor internally, historically you would be able to do that by wandering over to their desk or chat to them or be quite visible. And I think now having to develop those relationships remotely is proving really tough for a lot of people, especially if they're quite new to their jobs.
Yeah.
Alex, from your perspective, what do you see as the things that are the most sort of the most relevant pandemic related issues in your world?
Yeah, I think I would echo some of the sentiments that Tim has alluded to in his description of those issues. And obviously I see it from the other side, which gives a useful perspective on how those issues sort of play out day to day. I think capital raising is obviously something that is hugely important to the alternative space, and it's how we sort of create our revenue. And I think Tim's right. I think what has clearly happened, and this was particularly acute in March and April, was not only were face-to-face meetings not possible, but I think also fairly pertinent in that equation was the ability of internal investment committees, allocators and pension funds to meet as well. It's not just the sort of ability of those people to go in and look at the alternatives managers with whom they might prospectively invest or currently invest. It's actually, can we meet up as an organization in the allocator to make a decision? And I think the effect that had was twofold. It delayed new investment decisions, whether they be subscriptions or redemptions, and push those back. And I think it's still continuing to push those back. So I think it does remain to be seen in sort of January, which is a fairly common time for all sorts of allocators to reassess the shape of their portfolio, how that plays out. And obviously people have had more time to adjust to sort of remote working and remote investment committees, that the mechanics of that and how that might work. And I guess we've got another quarter of the year to see how that comes about. Yeah, ODD is tricky. I personally don't think that physical meetings will happen with the same sort of frequency as they previously did. I think there'll be a sort of retrenchment from certain types of business travel generally, and that will have an effect. US managers coming to do ODD in person US allocators coming to do ODD in person and London-based managers. Does that make sense? And importantly, does that even play well in the context of, say, ESG and those sorts of concerns around air travel? I don't think it does. And I think this crisis will be an accelerant for some of those concerns to play out. So I think, everything, as I say, Tim mentions is relevant and something that I'm seeing firsthand, but I don't think we've yet seen the full timeline of that play out yet. I think we'll know more when COVID develops. We'll know more whether travel comes back in the same way, which, as I said, personally, I don't think it will. And we'll also know more kind of come the turn of the year when sort of big annual reinvestment or reallocation decisions are made by some of those major allocators. But yeah, it's certainly been disruptive to the investment and capital raising process in a way that probably wasn't the case in 2008 in quite the same way.
And so, Tim, when you talk about the flight to quality or the larger investors sort of maybe benefiting a bit, what do you mean by a large investor? I mean, the numbers that we throw around in the alternative sector are always so big. What do you think constitutes a big player in this space?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think, and that number always moves around, and perhaps it's smaller than it was, certainly in some asset classes. I think for managers now, I think the hardest phase is once they've launched and they've reached perhaps a little sort of critical mass where they're at break even, and where that is obviously very dependent on the strategy, but that may be at 50 million, 100 million, 200 million, whatever. I think the hard phase for them is the next phase, and that's the growth to $1 billion or more. So I think if you say what are the larger managers these days, it's probably over $1 billion or more, because if only that they have made that jump from getting themselves set up and pushing through with some good performance and able to attract significant investors. I think these days the level of investment from the larger investors is so variable, and I think as well, managers that can and are able to get a really sort of a very well-known key investor through the door, not necessarily as seed capital, but later on demonstrating they've got good performance. I think that's really vital, and that's the phase that hopefully takes them on to growing and launching the next product to the next product to the next product. And that's always been the difficult thing. Again, and you know, as Alex was saying, made more difficult, of course, because the investment committee process has also slowed down for those people.
Mm. And in your view, what do you see as how COVID plays out next year? I mean, obviously, it's been a very busy week for that in relation to like rumours around lockdown and further restrictions in the UK. It seems, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of this money is not that domestic, it's quite international. And is the reliance on travel and the ability to like have face-to-face meetings with people in different jurisdictions a particular problem if Alex is right and international travel is, you know, another few years away or possibly never returning in the way it was?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be a case of people adapting. I agree with Alex, and I think even if travel returns, I'm not sure that people will have the either the ability or the will to do it as much as they previously had. So I think it's a question of just adapting to the new processes for capital raising, for DD, for dealing with your investors on a day-to-day basis. We've been doing it now for 6 months, so hopefully we should be able to do it long term. And ultimately, the cash is still there to be allocated, is still there to be invested. It's not going to go away. And so those international clients, particularly US plans, US state plans, they're always going to be looking for those opportunities. And hopefully managers will be able to take them.
Yeah, I'd agree with Tim. I think the opportunities will still be there. I always, when this topic comes up, and it's something I thought about, it's always interesting to think, well, what was the actual motivation in the first place for a face-to-face on-site DD meeting? Well, you know, a lot of the content is content that can be delivered either by Zoom or email or a combination thereof. So let's get to the nitty-gritty, especially with the smaller managers, with the newer managers. And you know, on the other side, you know, the big pension fund allocators, you know, whether they're US state pension funds or some of the big Canadians or you know whoever they are internationally, some of the sovereign wealth guys, you know, what they are very often interested in is having a wander around the trading floor, you know, looking to see, you know, actually, do these guys look like a hedge fund? You know, do they look like, you know, they have the office space? Do they look like, you know, they are doing things in a way that you would expect, that sort of harks back to those days of, you know, meeting rooms and everything else? Is what we're getting what we thought we were getting? And the only real way to assess that is by having that sort of wonder. So I think very often I've always thought that the substance of those meetings is something that is in some ways secondary to being on site and, you know, kicking the tires of, you know, making sure that the institution is what it says it is. So how does that then play out in the context of COVID and a reduction in travel, especially for those smaller managers? Well, I'm not sure I know the answer. It will be a challenge, and those sorts of slightly more esoteric checks or assessments will have to be made elsewise. But I think it is interesting to at least take a step back and at least consider what the purpose of those meetings was in the first place, in order to then try and establish how they can be conducted in the future.
I think my wife used to work in asset management sales, and I've got a few friends who do it. And I think, especially if you're one of those salespeople and you go into a smaller manager, maybe with one strategy, or all the investors, where the money is, but you've got to go and get them comfortable to allocate to your new place that they may not know much about. And I think you're right. Once you get to that stage, it's a question of, is their infrastructure right, and are they set up to do it? For some of the emerging managers, it's also going to be about actually how do they get to that point where the allocators know them well enough, because a lot of those meetings were done in New York, they're done over drinks, they're done like where those sales guys have quite a social interaction with their target investors. And if that's gone for 3 to 5 years, almost they're going to need a different model of how they start interacting and interfacing with those people for the first time. Moving on, looking at Brexit. I don't want to spend too long on Brexit because I have a feeling we're probably going to spend God knows how long talking about Brexit over the next few weeks. But it's come back into the news as a sort of interesting aside to the COVID narrative. It's the one space where within the alternative space, you actually find a lot of Brexiteers, and sometimes quite committed Brexiteers, in a way that I think you don't so much in the law firms and in the investment banks. What do you guys see as the impact or not the next few weeks or months of Brexit is going to have on the alternatives sector?
Well, I think the first thing to remember, and we as an industry sometimes forget it, is that we're actually in a very lucky position, because the alternative industry as a whole doesn't really utilize the EU mechanics around passporting and branching to the extent that wider asset management industry, investment banking does. So although it feels like it's a huge issue, it's happily, for our small part of the world, not so bad as it could be. I think that there are the two direct issues from my perspective are obviously on marketing and your ability to manage products, and how those play out. It's really a question of, it should all be fine. The FCA's agreed with regulators the mechanics to allow people to continue to market under AIFMD. That stuff is there. It's highly unlikely that on the 1st of January, you're not going to be able to manage your Lux fund or your Irish fund. That would just cause too much market chaos. So I think, absent a real breakdown in relations, you like to think in those aspects at least, managers, whilst they won't necessarily have certainty as to how things will play out, at least they may have some comfort that the walls won't come falling down at that point in time. I think though that what that ignores, and what Alex will be much better able to talk to than me, are all of the issues that on a practical level that managers are going to need to deal with the reporting, with their trading. Because as a funds lawyer, they're the bits that I often happily am able to ignore. But obviously for a manager, that's a real day-to-day issue. And the sense I get, at least when I look at it and when I look at the releases coming out, is that is a headache, or at least potentially a headache.
Alex, what are your views on?
Yeah, I'd largely agree, and obviously it depends. Speaking from my position in-house, it very largely depends on the makeup and domiciliation of your funds. We run non-EU AIFs from a full scope UK AIFM, which makes the analysis from the point of view of things like marketing actually even easier. And indeed, looking at say us versus say a Lux AIFM or an Irish AIFM, from the point of view of trading continuity, in some ways our ongoing relationships with our brokers is easier, because whereas previously there might be some sort of issue around, say, one of the big UK based banks providing ongoing services to what will be legacy EU-based AIFM. For a London-based AIFM, nothing really changes at all, and that's been, I guess, reassuring for someone in my position. I think Tim's right though from the point of view of trading continuity. We were very keen to make sure that some of the big EU-based central clearing counterparties, for example, US and London brokers, had the same access that they did. So this is some conversations that we had, and very often what the banks have done way in advance of the previous deadline is they've retooled one of their European legacy EU-based vehicles entities, or they set up a new one. So in the case of Barclays, for example, they've set up Barclays Bank Ireland. Lots of people have gone to France and Frankfurt, and what they'll simply do, or what they had done already in anticipation of a lack of reciprocity in terms of membership requirements, was say, well, if you want to be a member in Eurex, fine, we'll just move our membership from London to Frankfurt entity or the Irish entity, and then you'll just have your orders for futures on Eurex routed through that that network internally. To the manager and to the fund, you don't see anything. So that's been reassuring, and I think honestly one of the most reassuring things in trading continuity is the sort of very diligent approach most of the major investment banks have taken, the money they've spent. I've spoken to some of our brokers, and the sums in terms of spend and outlay on Brexit compliance are extraordinary, properly extraordinary, 9 figures, high 9 figures in terms of Brexit compliance. So I think from a purely human point of view, what was it all about? What was it all worth? Is this money really well spent in the grander scheme of things? Probably not, but certainly from a professional point of view, the fact that our brokers have been so on top of it is great. I think there are some other sort of interesting political issues around, for example, the dominance of London in the cleared OTC derivative space. LCH is, it clears way over 90% of euro-denominated interest rate swaps, and the EU aren't very happy about it. And there were news stories about exactly that point last week, and how the phased transition of a proportion of that flow, might ultimately move to, say, Eurex OTC Clear, which is the sort of the major platform in mainland Europe. But the reality is, as things stand at the moment, if you are in any way a market participant in the cleared IRS space, do you want to clear anywhere else but LCH? No, probably not. And in reality, LCH has a broader range of functional cleared OTC products in its arsenal than the competitors. So it's no doubt of dominance that ultimately the EU will want to break, but for the time being, even after January, whatever happens, it won't. The market will continue to trade there because that's where the market trades.
Well, so, yeah. I think we can agree. If some of the more the sort of worse predictions about Brexit don't come to pass, given the other stuff going on, that would be a nice change. If we go on, both of you guys have career paths that, when we speak to, especially associates in the main firms who are probably going to make up a lot of our audience, are very keen to emulate. And I think one of the questions we're asking every guest on General Counselling is, the private practice person, what do you think makes a great in-house lawyer in your market? So Tim, from the perspective of a fund's partner, what do you think makes a really good in-house counsel within an investor or fund?
I think they have to be incredibly flexible. And people in private practice don't tend to be. We're quite set in our ways. We like our particular ways of doing things. I think going in-house, and I spent a very short time on Secomment many years ago now, but they're incredibly helpful things because you realize just how much can get thrown at someone. And the lawyer's got to be able to deal with a myriad of different things. And I think they've also got to have flexibility in a slightly different way, and a flexibility that, again, you need in private practice, but I think presents itself even more when you're in-house in relation to dealing with individuals, and therefore being able to present the advice, as it were, or the product or the finished article or whatever they've asked for, and deal with them in a way that suits that individual. Because we ultimately are sitting on the other end of a phone line or a web camera, or we're sitting in an office in the city and they're in Mayfair. We're not sitting on the trading floor or next door, where that individual gets up and walks around and talks to us. And I think that ability is really key. And that's where I see lots of private practice lawyers that I've known through the years have found it most challenging, where they've gone from quite an ordered environment in relation to the pace of the day, who you're dealing with and what you're doing, to being in the heart of a business, of a commercial business, where anything can happen. And I think also that ability as well to figure out who to please and when to please them is obviously key. And I saw, you see in-house lawyers, and the work that they do can just stack up because there's always something to do. And that ability to prioritize and think, no, I can leave this, or no, actually, I need to think 4 steps ahead because I've got to get this done because we're going to have an issue. Again, the skills you need in private practice, but I think in-house, those in-house lawyers that I've worked with through the years that have had fantastic careers have all been very good at those elements of being flexible and adaptable.
And Alex, so on the other side of the fence, as a general counsel, what do you see as the attributes that make a really good external counsel or an external advisor?
I guess it would be all of the comments that Tim's made. I agree with, but I think to focus in slightly on one aspect of that, it is understanding your principles, understanding the culture of the principles and thus the firm. And when I say understanding, it's a very nuanced way of understanding those people. It's understanding their personalities, understanding their relative risk appetite, and it's understanding their views on the future of the business, how they want to progress, where they are in their relative career. I think that changes a lot depending on the hedge fund, because you get the sort of the single dominant owner model very commonly, and it's then understanding that one person's culture. That's not quite the case for me. There are more than one principal, but it's the same job. It's the same sort of cultural integration. And you kind of have to be expected to understand that quite quickly in order to be successful. So even from the sort of interview stage, can I get on board with their relative appetite for risk, their relative approach, and everything else? And once you have that sort of understanding and have built that understanding, I think what you can then do is start to contextualize both your and external counsel's legal advice.
And do you think, are there any particular things that when you've had advice from a law firm partner, you often hear people wanting to actually get advice rather than just told what the position is? Are there any particular things that you would advise junior partners who are giving you guys advice that they should think about when working with you?
I think the classic lawyer's answer, it depends, is something that principals who I work with don't very much like. And that's a bit trite, but I think it's the case. They want to know which way to go, and they want to know it quickly. Yeah. And I think that's difficult for a private practice lawyer. That's not the job. So I think very often a good in-house lawyer or general counsel, their role is often to sort of parse that advice. That's what you're doing. You're sort of recontextualizing it in a way that the principals can understand and get on board with. You don't want your principals to get pissed off at private practice lawyers, because very often they're the people you want to work with. Yeah. So I think to a great extent, what you're trying to do not only is contextualize things for the principals for whom you work, but you're also trying to protect your own relationships. Because very often I have certainly seen it be the case that because advice has either been given directly or sort of been given via a general counsel, but with the sort of optionality or sort of qualification that they don't much like, they then take against the counsel. And that may be right and may be wrong, but if it's wrong from the point of view of the general counsel, your relationship with them might very well be ended, which mightn't be great for you. So I think identifying the times at which you have to really, really sort of parse the advice, cut it down, focus it, and then transmit it is a skill in itself. There are no doubt out there partners, senior partners, mid-level partners, junior partners who principals tend to take to very, very quickly, and they like the way they work. And we've got an advisor in terms of our partnership advice who my principals love and have always loved. And it's not appropriate to mention names here, but there are certainly those people out there. But it's also the case that, for example, in tax law, say, we get a lot of tax advice, and tax is very nuanced and it does have a lot of variables, and giving advice in a definitive way is very often impossible. So that's tricky. Yeah, it really is. But yeah, I think it's about that sort of cultural understanding, being able to understand how they want things, what sort of things that they want to hear and how they want to hear them, and then contextualizing private practice advice where necessary. I think the other thing I would say, just as a sort of to round up, your flexibility is absolutely the word. You can have anything thrown at you, anything. And things that you have never heard of, never touched upon before. It feels like going back to doing the LPC, where you were given, I'm sure Tim remembers these research tasks on some obscure piece of law, and you're literally back to square one. And you have to be sort of ready for that, and you have to be confident about that, and you have to sort of really leverage your network of contacts and start looking on the legal encyclopedias again for the first time in a long time. You are going to be out of your comfort zone, especially as a general counsel, regularly, and making your peace with that and doing it in a calm and confident way is crucial.
I think on that, and that is a very good piece of advice for anyone going into an in-house role. Before we move on, Tim, what was the best piece of careers advice you've ever had, and what was it? Who gave it to you, and what was it?
I've been thinking about this one, and the answers are all quite trite. One chap, when I was a trainee, I was asking, he was a fellow trainee, a couple of intakes ahead of me, and there was a very senior corporate associate, and I said, how's he done so well, and how he seems everyone rates him? And he said, this is the trick to a great career, just marry someone you don't like. Now of course it's backfired completely because everyone's at home. But leaving that aside, another piece of advice someone gave is that you have the work, you have the people, and you have the clients, and you need to like 2 out of the 3 most of the time, and if you don't, then you're in the wrong job. I actually think, and it goes back to what Alex was talking about just then, and delivering the right advice to in-house lawyer, and it's understanding what they are trying to achieve. It's understanding their business. It's understanding some of the nuances behind the question, and putting yourself in their shoes and asking, what would I do? Because it's no good being asked a question and giving the answer no. Well, that is no good. What would I do presented with that answer? Well, that's no good to me. And I think the best piece of advice I was given was is keep asking questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And it's people can be very reluctant to do that because they think that the partner's too busy. They think that the general counsel in-house is too busy. But ultimately, delivering the right advice, it's more important to get the right advice across. And I think people are often afraid to ask questions and delve a little bit deeper and understand a little bit more when they really shouldn't be.
I think one of our previous guests on a previous episode made that exact point, that if you don't know what you're being asked, make sure you ask the questions on it, because the worst thing you can do is give an answer that you think is what they're wanting, but actually you've missed a point because you haven't answered the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the best lawyers will understand the client's business, not only what they're trying to achieve in the question that they've asked or the piece of work that you've been given, but also what that business does and how that business works and what makes it tick. And if you really understand that, that helps enormously to hopefully giving the advice that will be welcomed.
So look, before we break, the last thing we really ask every guest on the General Counselling podcast is who their GOAT lawyer is. So for those of you unfamiliar with sporting and acronyms, GOAT stands for greatest of all time. And we ask every guest who their GOAT lawyer is. It can be someone real or fictional, alive or dead, very personal, or someone who's a celebrity lawyer. Alex, you want to kick off? Who would you pick?
Yeah, I thought about this, and I thought I knew the answer pretty well. And actually, then I had a sort of a re-evaluation of this lawyer in sort of context, and thought maybe actually I don't. But anyway, I'll go with it. So before I applied to sort of university, and before I even necessarily had set my sights on a career in the law, I was, from an old family contact, recommended reading the autobiography of a very famous Court of Appeal law lord called Lord Denning, who most of your listeners will be familiar with at one time or other. And it's a great book because he was, a Court of Appeal judge and master of the rolls for many years through the late 60s into the early 80s. And he never got promoted to the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords because he was a bit of a renegade. But in that sort of belying his status and reputation as a bit of a renegade, I think it perfectly exemplifies, and this is without wishing to get too philosophical, but it perfectly exemplifies what we are trying to do, as lawyers and as practitioners of the law, which is we're trying to take what a society at large considers to be, at that time, a largely moral social judgment on behavior, whether that be criminal behavior or contractual behavior or whatever it is, and then somehow codify that into this normative and descriptive framework. And that is an almost impossible task. That is the central paradox at the heart of a legal system, and in particular a common law system. So in particular, Lord Denning, used to sort of very often take a step back in his judgments and go, well, is it really the case that someone should, be able to successfully pursue a civil suit against a cricket club when, a cricket ball lands in their garden? I think his love of cricket probably coloured his judgment quite a lot, but nonetheless, it was very much a sort of a theme of his judgment that he'd take a step back. Now, that wasn't always particularly compliant with the key sort of maxims and facets of common law. It's precedent-led, and you should follow the precedent. However, Lord Denning felt that he sometimes knew better and had his finger on the pulse of what society thought, more so than the common law necessarily did. This is always entertaining, and in my view, having thought about it, he probably generally stepped the right side of that line very often. You can get into sort of the technicalities around, I think it's promissory estoppel and things like that, which is not great for your audience here. But nonetheless, I think he very much was someone who tried to achieve what I think the law, especially from a common law perspective, is trying to achieve. And for that, I have an enormous amount of respect for him. The reason I've kind of come to reevaluate is I think it's interesting looking at what he did and how he approached things in the context of what we now have, which is the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court seems to have taken upon itself as part of its mandate, although it wasn't mandated in its establishment necessarily, to kind of be very policy driven and moralistic. And I think this is best seen in decisions around Brexit and some of the behaviour of the government, Boris's government before Christmas, and them taking views on what is right and wrong outside of the sort of remit of common law. I feel personally, and there's lots of commentary on this, that they take things very often too far, and they are outside of their remit, and they do destroy some of the key sort of elements of the common law and indeed the constitution, the unwritten constitution that we have, and the doctrine of separation of powers and everything else. And that worries me a little bit in terms of the way that they wield their power and may continue to do so.
And you think maybe that's a legacy of some of the stuff Lord Denning was doing?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think maybe I'm being slightly romantic about it and sort of thinking back to my days as a sort of a 16-year-old reading that book. But you know, that was certainly my pause for thought when I saw the question on your email and thought, well, actually, should I reevaluate it a bit? And maybe I should go back and read the book again. But yeah, my goat lawyer would be Lord Denning.
Well, we'll give you, if you're a guest on a future edition of the podcast, we'll ask you if it's played. Tim, I hope you're not going to go with Perry Mason or someone after that.
No. I thought this was actually the hardest question that you wrote on your email. Yeah, I suppose I've been lucky because I've been worked with lawyers in an industry that's relatively young, and therefore have shaped that industry and shaped the way that we do things, and I do things on a daily basis. My sort of boss at the moment is a partner in the US called Steve Vine, and he's one of those individuals in the US alternative industry that's fated. And I sort of had a few years looking at how he does things, and before that it was Ian Cullen when I was in my previous role. But we were in a negotiation, and this sort of made just remember this, and it was one of those negotiations. I can't remember how many people were on the call. It was far too many. People were all talking at the same time. They were shouting over each other, the usual stuff. And when it gets a bit tense and a bit heated, and there was vehement disagreement over a particular point. And Steve is a man of few words, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. But essentially, someone on the call just said, "Well, what do you think, Steve?" And he said, "Well, I think the answer is X." And that was the first and only time the other side said, "Okay, if he thinks that, we'll agree with that." And you've got to be pretty good to get that kind of respect. So that was probably my career the most entertaining, I suppose, goat moment.
That's a high level of gravitas.
It is, yes.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you both so much for joining us and giving up your time. Thank you to Akin Gump, Tim Pearce, and Alex Mitchell from LMR. That was a brilliant episode. We're very grateful for you guys taking the time out of your extremely busy work lives to share your insights. Next up on the General Counselling podcast is Global Finance. So keep an eye on the Montresor Legal LinkedIn page. Thanks very much for listening.